is given, and what follow-up is there in the process? Dan?
Through you, Madam Chair, it can be as complex as a $35 million engineering assignment, and the example for that would be the Woodward upgrade. Or it could be something as minor as having to do a vibration study on a pump, or to do a load-bearing analysis on a minor structural change that you were going to make in a facility that might cost $5,000. And it can be everything in between. So there's a lot of complexity to what we might characterize as a consulting engineering assignment.
Thank you, through the chair. And if I could follow up on that, whatever you just said about something to a pipe, would you, A, not have staff on site that could have already looked at that? And B, what then would happen in terms of a process of hiring a consultant? Who makes the determination? What level of management? And what happens moving forward? Who do they get the approval from? How do they seek a consultant? How do they award the contract?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I think generally speaking, the decision to hire a consultant would be made at a manager level. Certainly that's been my experience in public works. So if somebody was on site and they observed something happening where they thought that there was a structural assignments where you're going to undertake a roster assignment or an RFP, it would definitely be made at a manager level, probably in consultation with the director.
Thank you, through the chair. And just to refresh my memory, anything under 10,000 doesn't have to go through procurement, correct? So a consultant could be hired with just award a contract, manager's discretion?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct.
Thank you. Through the chair, how do we determine, and maybe Charles, you can speak to this, how do we determine how much we're going to be paying consultants? What formula do we follow?
Through the chair, the determination ultimately comes from bidding. Obviously, an estimate and evaluation are done of, when there are consultants, of what likely the work would be, and working up an estimate and a forecast and a budget. But ultimately, that's why we tender, so that we know that we're getting the best rates. And if they don't marry up to the estimate, then there's various processes in place to make a determination as to whether to go forward, I have to assume.
Through you, Mr. Chair, if I can just add to that, the roster program gives us great visibility on the costs of all the roster categories. So we have a lot of information there that would guide us as to what we should be paying for each of the disciplines.
Thank you. Charles, through the chair, for work under 10,000, were you looking at anything under 10,000? Any contracts under 10,000?
Through the chair, no, we didn't.
Okay.
We didn't look at any.
Thank you. I guess, Chris, if I could have you address, and Councillor Partridge alluded to this as an uncomfortable conversation. What did you find most alarming about this report?
I mean, there's a number of things. I think certainly the idea that an individual can be highlighting hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings, and the impression the report leaves you is that we just dismiss that, and so obviously that would concern me, and as well as I think there's a reference to a $30 million consulting assignment, which I do think you need to hear more about. It's not quite as I think the letter reads. So, you know, I think, you know, that grabs our attention. You know, but, you know, to point at one or two things, I mean, you know, overall, it'd be hard not to, it'd be hard to read this report and not you know, see a number of red flags. And it doesn't matter what seat you're in. I think it's it just creates lots of concern. But you know, the good thing about these processes is that, you know, things get discovered and then people have a chance to go through it and then provide responses and then and make improvements where they have to be made. And so that's the value of these exercises. But I do think Dan needs to, if it's okay, to speak to the $30 million project, and just the way it reads here and what actually took place, I think is important for you to know.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the biogas project was a project that was identified to respond to the infrastructure stimulus funding program that the province and the federal government brought out in 2009 after the economy declined significantly. Whenever those funding programs come out, we're obviously very eager to access that funding, but what happens is you generally have to bring forward projects that were not scheduled in that year. That's a common requirement. In order for us to be able to deliver that project on time, we used a different delivery model for the project called EPCM. So it's engineer, procure, and then construction manage. The way that differs typically from what the city would do is we would generally hire a design engineer to design something for us, then we would put it out to tender, and then we would construction manage it either with our own staff or with a consultant. This was different in that the engineering firm that we gave it to was CH2M Hill, who has a tremendous, and so they were engineering and designing it while they were building it. So they were putting out the tenders as they would design each segment of the facilities. They would put out the tenders so that we could get it done very, very quickly. Had we relied on the typical design, bid, build model that we normally do, there's no way we would have achieved the deadlines that they had identified. So the entire purchase order was made to CH2M Hill, and then they did the procurement after that for the construction trades. Each time they put out a new package of work, they got 3 bids. So at the end of the day, the entire $30 million PO was for a consulting engineering firm, but embedded within that, the vast majority of those costs were construction. So there's some nuance to the engineering consulting firm that we issued the PO to, and that's why it was recorded the way it was. So when Charles' staff did the audit, they picked up on that there could have been an accounting practice that would have more clearly illustrated where the money was being spent had it been construction or had it been consulting engineering. So that's just one of the examples that I'm very familiar with, obviously, because of my background, but it just highlighted that maybe the accounting after the fact and how the information went into our system could be strengthened.
Thank you for that, and through the chair, in hindsight, would you have changed your accounting?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it would, certainly for audit purposes, it would have made it much more clear what money was being spent where.
Thank you. I want to go back to the conclusion that there was a lack of corporate governance over the hiring and management of consultants, including business cases, significant cost coding errors, unbudgeted expenditures, cost overruns, project changes, delays, large contingencies, and non-value-added activities that do not demonstrate effective and efficient management practices. Having read that, that really does test my confidence in our senior management team. I found that very disturbing. Chris, can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I share the same initial concern. There's no question, and I think that I think the steps that we've been taking now for certainly starting in 2016 and extending on now are going to give you the kind of comfort that you would have expected to have in the first place. So I really need to, look at not just what's written in the report, but working with Mike and the rest of the SLT and working with our business implementation team, go through all of the procedures that are governing how we procure projects and how we retain consultants and how we account for the accounting to make sure that, where there is minor modifications that they're identified and undertaken, and where there's major work that needs to be undertaken, that we identify that and take steps to fix. I can, and I've said this many times to this committee, the private sector is all about profit, making profit, and the public sector is about trust and confidence. I can understand when you see this document and what it leaves you is that your concerns about the trust and confidence you need in our organization. So, and I think that, the process whereby we get a chance to address the comments raised in the report and then provide a very specific course of action to fix the things that need to be fixed through this action plan that Charles has recommended, I think you will see that, things will be well in hand. I would suggest that some things are reasonably well in hand already, but we need to highlight that for you as well. So, I mean, yeah, the whole thing does leave some questions in everyone's mind as to whether or not all the, the gates that need to be in place are in place and working the way they're supposed to. So that's why I think when that look to address some of what you have in this report. And when he raised that and committee approved it several weeks ago, I think my response at the time was quite positive, because I do think that those levels of defense are really critical to giving people the kind of confidence and trust that you want in your administration. So I'm not going to dance around this. I'm going to just simply tell you that there are things in here that absolutely bother me, bother everyone on SLT. But it's not what I say, it's what I do that will matter in the end. And this is why it will not take, 6 or 9 months for us to get back to you on this. We're already working on the report that you asked us to address. This just helps to scope out exactly what will be in that report. And so, that's kind of where we are right now.
Thank you, and I really do look forward to having your presentation with the next report. Those are my questions. I know Councillor Johnson. I'll take the chair back, and then Councillor Collins, followed by Councillor Collins.
Thanks very much, Chair Skelly. I'd like to go back to this question of definition, and through you to Mr. Brown. What definition of consulting are you using in this report?
Through the chair, the definition of consulting that we're using is, I guess, a very broad, the hiring of outside services. By that, consultants that work on studies, consultants that that are hired through the roster, consulting work, technical services work, as broad as it could possibly be.
And through you, Madam Chair, if I'm understanding, there has to be an analytical or advice-giving or intellectual component. In other words, if we're hiring someone for manual labor, that is in consulting. To be totally clear, it's analytical or intellectual, or those are the qualities that mark consulting as opposed to non-consulting?
Through the chair, that's affirmative, although we found examples of things like that being called consulting.
What do you mean by that?
Well, as I said, one of the issues with consulting and the definition is that we can agree that that is the definition, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the organization itself. That's why there needs to be clarification.
So jobs not marked by an analytical
So a manual
component.
labor type of service, for example, might very well be allocated to consulting, is what we're saying. That's what we're finding.
So, and to clarify, I think I do understand, jobs not marked by an analytical component or an advice-giving component would be classified
Correct.
Potentially as consulting.
Correct, potentially,
right?
yes. That's the risk that we see.
Your definition of consulting so that everyone is on the same page. So that is helpful. We don't have one now, and I see more clearly why we need a good, clear definition. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity in our overall city budget conversations to ask for an update on our performance measurement dashboard project. And I'm wondering if Mr. Brown could answer the question how that work ties into this challenge. It would seem to me, and where I'm going with it, it would seem to me that this need around clear rules and practices and definitions around our hiring of outside consultants might be an example of something that would be measured and caught up through a robust performance measurement and dashboard system, which, as I understand it, we're looking forward to. If Mr. Brown could comment.
Through the chair, I agree. I would like to see this translated into ultimately performance measures, particularly when we make recommendations with respect to annual reporting on consulting, the kind of analysis that I would presume that would include performance measures to go along with, for example, the recurring engagements issue, the dependency that we have on consulting, et cetera, performance measures that would help enlighten us with respect to those issues. Second point that Chris gave, heartened to see that one of our recommendations has been implemented in terms of putting together, as we recommended, a dedicated team to go after these kinds of issues and make the improvements that were the outfall of that report.
Very good. So I'll look forward then for a new reason to our performance measurement report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Madam Chairman, and I would present as a three-part motion that corporate services staff, prior to the development of the 2018 tax-supported operating budget, distribute the corporate gapping target of $4.5 million to city departments, that staff report through the 2018 tax and rate capital budget processes on the potential for investments in innovation, including those referred in report AUD 17008, that will result in savings, and C, that staff report back through the multi-year budget subcommittee on the potential to further expand the description of capital projects to include consulting costs for those projects that are forecast to include external consultants. And if I could speak to the motion. Seconded by Councillor Pearson. The first part is on heard from Charles through the report that some staff are utilizing in-year operating savings on their labor costs to pay for, in some cases, unbudgeted or in other cases, over-budget consulting fees. And I think that, as I stated through the budget process, I don't think it's fair that, Mike comes to us with that global number, we approve it, and finance hopes through the calendar year that the rest of the corporation is on board, and we hope that we're going to meet our target. I don't think that's, I think that system's too loose and it needs to be tightened up, and I believe that finance staff should have the ability to investigate ways and means in which to assign those savings to departments to ensure that they're appropriately coming back at year end. So that's part A. Part B speaks to the whole issue of innovation and tracking technology, and I think we've clearly seen through Laura's work in HR examples a corporate issue that's been to this committee several times, a concern for council. We now have technology that helps us track, and we can find out, who's taking what time off in what areas and for what reason, and that's helping us address absenteeism, and I think we're seeking the same now as it relates to overtime. And the same should hold true. I think it was part of Chris's original presentation. Information comes to council as it relates to another check and balance. The line items clearly identify at this point. It doesn't get into the details in terms of the reasons or rationale as to why they're included in the capital budget. And to be clear and to be honest, I'm not looking for a third budget book. So with part 3 here, more information is good, but I would leave it to staff to consider how that information is translated to us, and certainly along some of the comments that were just made, that should probably be an annual exercise. And so I would present those, seconded by Councillor Pearson. I want to address the whole issue of the definition, which was the first issue that I raised in my question to Charles this morning, which came as a big surprise to me. There's far too much money involved with this issue in the discussion we've had today to let this sit for a formal management response to come back and then incorporate some policy changes in time for 2018. I know that senior management team have already started working on this. This report was hot off the press last week, and I know their phones were ringing about what's contained here. And if you had the opportunity to speak to them as I did, I know that they're already working on it. But I don't think it's enough to let this pass in terms of guessing. We've already approved the 2017 capital budget quite some time ago. So staff are already working with the new envelope that's been provided for consultants for this calendar year. And my concern is that every day, week, and month that pass with these issues in the process of being resolved, the fact that we wouldn't at least get something out corporately to our operating departments through, I know Chris has a regular message that he puts out on social media, I believe there's a video that's done. I know that there are now corporate communication booklets that are being distributed, and of course, just a simple email to staff, it can be immediate and have immediate results. So I want to give the informal direction today that somehow whatever checks and balances need to be in place through communications, as far down as it needs to go. I think it was a good question by Councillor Partridge in terms of who in the organization has discretion to hire consultants. As far down as we need to go in terms of the organization with a communication plan immediately, that needs to happen with a clear definition of what a consultant is, and the discretion that some may or may not have in terms of hiring them. That needs to be immediately addressed before the report comes back in terms of management's formal response. And I honestly believe, as was referenced a couple of times today, through the budget process, my complaint in looking at year-end negative variances has been that our finance department needs to be provided more discretion and more power in terms of being the budget police. And maybe that's not the best term to use, whether it's the role of the principal maybe is a better term in terms of ensuring that there is accountability and transparency. All departments certainly need to be accountable for their actions, but I've often found that the more involved our finance staff are as it relates to providing another safety net or another check and balance, the better off we are as a corporation. And I've found too often in those that finance staff has not been involved with certain hot budget or issues. And so I would point to transit. Transit their own finance staff. They're technically not staff that report to Mike Zagaric. And that for me is a problem, especially with some of the budget items that we're looking at, not just with operations and the overages there, but we have a lot of complex budget issues we're dealing with HSR, and I just use them as an example, and I'm not pointing them out to pick on them. I've already raised these comments in open session during the budget process. But, we have funding coming from upper levels of government. We have multi-year plans that are at play. We have budget variances that are ongoing there. And I personally would like to see Mike and his team that he has around him more involved in trying to solve problems and prevent them from happening in the first place. And I think Charles's report today is a great example of how finance staff can become more involved. I know that Chris and senior management team have embraced that message and are making changes corporately to make that happen. But I think today's the recommendations that flow through today's report clearly enunciate other opportunities for finance as another check and balance, another safety net. So if there's an opportunity maybe for Chris or Mike or someone else to comment on the informal direction apart from the formal direction that we will provide with Charles' recommendations and the other recommendations that I'll put, I would appreciate hearing that before we call the question.
Thank you. Chris, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, if I can, Madam Chair. First of all, I will definitely use all methods that I've been using to get the communication of this matter out. I will be in front of the Public Works Extended Management team tomorrow, which is basically the supervisors, superintendents, managers, directors, and be talking very specifically about what it is that we're talking about right now and all the things that are underway to address what I think, Councillor, you're rightfully pointing out here. There's a lot of wonderful and very helpful, useful advice that I know finance people have that can help people run their businesses better. So I think we need to, shift away from this thinking that corporate services, and that's including HR, are support services, effectively a crutch for someone else. That's not what they are. They are they're skilled professionals and understand their businesses quite well and can certainly help those in the departments be effective when it comes to delivering projects. And I think that, in a very kind of global, general way, that's what's going to unfold. But to your point, we're not going to wait a few months to get a report out. That silence will be deafening, and so we will get the message out about the use of consultants and just the general way in which we govern, the expenditures that are occurring for these projects that you rely on us to deliver. So we will definitely take care of that.
Through the chair, I would just add, and one of the first actions that we'll leave today is it was Councillor Johnson who made reference to the definition. So as we discussed consulting, what I heard today was descriptions of contractual that were considered consulting. I heard examples of construction. So we need to do a better job of defining, but more importantly is training staff. And we need to develop those guidelines and train staff so that we have a common understanding as it relates to not only consulting work, but I suspect if we look into contractual work, there may be some consulting work that is coded as contractual and vice versa. You and the taxpayers have confidence that we understand the nature of our work and that we're endeavoring to deliver on it effectively and efficiently. To the motion is absolutely we'll report back on the action items. I think an audit's report as they apply their lens as to how these overages are funded. The one observation was 62% of the overspends funded through gapping. So I would suggest by distributing that gapping, council is affecting by adding some tension to the departments as to how we operate. And by adding that tension, it is likely going to create some efficiencies through that process alone. So again, we will report back in 2017, but I assure you we'll start putting our minds to some of these action items, the 12 recommendations, and our more thorough response back.
Madam Clerk, I have a question. Before we vote on this motion, I have a comment. Can I make it now or should I wait until the motion? Is that okay? Is that okay, Councillor? Councillor Johnson, can you take the chair again? And it's about, it's more of a comment about the skill set and how surprised I am that our senior managers don't, or even managers in general, are not aware of the skill set of staff within the city. I mean, we spend a fair amount of time, I think, working with our staff and asking our senior managers to develop staff. And I think it's important that we identify that as an ongoing issue that was highlighted in this report so that we can perhaps rely less on outside consultants and work with our staff. And I mean, it's just a win-win for the taxpayer and a win-win for staff itself. And finally, and it's just a comment, I've been here a year now, just over a year, and I would say that council is very good at recognizing when our staff should be applauded for the work they do. And that's why I find this is so troubling, that this is coming out now. So I think that as Councillor Partridge alluded to, you know, there are sometimes uncomfortable conversations, but this is certainly, you know, we're there when staff needs to be applauded. We spend an awful lot of time offering accolades to staff, but this is a very troubling finding in a report, and I just think you realize now how serious that this is, and I hope that we do see a very quick resolution. Those are my comments. Thank you. And I guess all those in favor? Carried. Madam Clerk, we need a motion now to receive the report. Moved by Councillor Collins, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All those in favor? Carried. Moving on to 8.2, Tax and Rate Operating Budget Variance Report. Unaudited FCS 16058B. Is there any discussion respecting 8.2? Seeing none, I need a motion to move. Moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Johnson. All those in favor? Carried. 8.3, is there any discussion respecting item 8.3? That is the accounts receivable write-offs. Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just had a couple of quick ones, and I'm not sure. I guess a number of them on Appendix B, page 1 of 1. We have a lot of them where they're invoices and we didn't collect late fees. Are we not being strong enough in making sure that they're aware that there will be fees if the bill? It goes on the next bill. There's no getting out of it. Believe me, I don't make a practice of that. Through you, Madam Chair.
Through you, Madam Chair. The majority of these items occur in the case where a department will ask accounts receivable to invoice a customer, and then the customer receives the invoice and typically asks for additional information that they're not really sure what it's about, or the backup hasn't been provided to them. and they'll contact accounts receivable, who will then contact the initiating department, ask for that additional information, and it takes a period of time sometimes to receive that information back from the department, and then to get it out to the customer, and then they pay. And quite often it might be a case of there was an adjustment to the invoice, so these represent in the majority of cases where the customer has asked for additional information and it's taken us a longer period of time to respond with the information they requested than
So then, with that, then, Madam Chair, through you, are we trying to tighten this up through the departments of more timely responses and information?
Through you, Madam Chairman, yes, we are working with the departments to try and ensure that when they send us a request for invoice, the proper information is available, either attached to the invoice or it's referenced where it is within the department if it's kept there, so that we don't items that we don't feel the customer will readily pay.
Okay, appreciate that. And on Appendix C, I guess, of the lodges, is it not standard practice that they pay ahead of what is due on the their monthly rent, so to speak?
Through you, Madam Chair, it really depends. In this case, there was no funds available when the person died. They may have no relatives. There's nobody paying the bill on their behalf. And when they die, there could be amounts owing, and it could be for such things as the sundry, the stores are up there, or it could be, in the case of the first person, it could be for there was no monies to pay. There's not a large enough pension coming in that would pay their monthly fees.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And lastly, I guess I just need to ask on Appendix D, the market and the number of exhausted efforts on collection. I mean, one jumps right out there as to how did this happen? There's, over almost $16,000 uncollectible from one vendor.
Through you, Madam Chair, John Hertel is responsible for the market operations, and he can provide the background information on that.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Good morning, John. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And through the chair, recognizing the long-standing profile and significance to our community, and ultimately the individual was not able to pay since deceased, and there is no monies in the estate. I would say that and the management of the finances, there are much tighter processes in place. There's also, I'll say, a much stronger enforcement for those vendors who are outside of, I'll say, a normal 30-day categorized as a unique and one-off situation.
There, Tilly's Produce, I'm going to say, and then you have Ben Tilly's. Are they were they connected?
Through the chair, yes, this was a situation where, with a lot of staff involvement, and I would say family and friends, there was an attempt to support the proprietor, and this particular individual came forward and tried to manage the stall and the finances associated, but again, it did all come to an end. Yeah.
Thank you. And if I just could ask, what's the monthly rate on an average stall?
Stalls are on a per square foot basis, and I would say the average, and there is quite a variance on.
Seeing none, may I have a motion to approve item 8.3, moved by Councillor Johnson, seconded by Councillor Collins. All those in favor? Carried. Moving on to item 8.4, tax appeals under section 357 and 358 of the Municipal Act. Any discussion? Councillor Pearson, moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Collins. All those in favor? Carried. On to 8. West 547 King Street East. Is there any discussion respecting 8.5? Seeing none, moved by Councillor Johnson, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All those in favor? Carried. Moving on to item 8.6, development charge demolition credit extension request from Penta Properties, 330 Nash Road. Is there any discussion respecting item 8.6? Moved by Councillor Collins, seconded by Councillor Johnson. All those in favor? Carried. Treasurer's Investment Report 2016 fiscal year by A.O.N. Hewitt. 8.7, is there any discussion respecting item 8.7? Moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Aidan Johnson. All those in favor? 01. Moved by Councillor Collins, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All those in favor? Carried. Are there any motions? Seeing none. Notices of motion. Are there any notices of motion? General information, other business amendments to the outstanding business list. May I please have a motion to approve the removal of the outstanding business list items as shown in item 11.1A? Moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Aidan Johnson. All those in favor? Carried. Is there any other items of general information or other business? Seeing none, moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Collins to adjourn. Carried. Thank you, folks.